Okay, welcome back. We're a little late already, so if we want to keep track and to be on time, we have a panel. Welcome to panel 3, which is entitled Bodies at the Border, where we will listen to 3 communications and we'll have the questions at the end. The first is from Ravinder Singh Rana. Wait, where is it? Here. Ravinder teaches English at Université Grenoble Alpes in France. His main focus is on British and Commonwealth literature and civilization. He defended his PhD thesis in December 2015 at Paul Valéry Université here in comparative literature on the theme of the Holocaust. It was entitled Race, Langage et Culture, dans l'œuvre de Jonathan Littell, Les Bienveillantes. And his current areas of research include Holocaust studies, partition studies, and Dalit studies. Thank you. And, sorry? You have 25 minutes.
Okay, so good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay, so this is more like a focus on how literature deals with should I pull myself? Yeah? Fine. Yeah. Okay. So how literature deals with real issues that are real. Okay. So in a new political development in India, the far-right BJP government passed the Citizenship Amendment Bill, CAB, that becomes the Citizenship Amendment Act after it was passed in both lower and upper houses of the Indian Parliament in 2019. The bill was meant to provide citizenship status to all refugees coming from Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, 3 countries, with the condition that they had to be Hindus, Sikh are the guys with turban, Christians, Buddhist, Jains, or Parsis. Parsis are, I don't know how to explain Parsis, but they're people from Pers, and now they are settled in India. So the law thereby did not allow Muslims to be eligible for this refugee status. And this was the first time a bill was passed in India on religious lines, and which resulted in humiliating an already stigmatized Muslim community after the 2014 general elections of the far-right party in India. And in spite of the protests all around the country and the national capital of Delhi coming under siege for almost half a year before the pandemic of coronavirus set in, the government never relented, not even till date. This act adopted by the Indian government can be perceived in the context of a larger politics that is practiced all over the world at the moment. Immigrants are welcome, but there is a clear distinction between the ones that are shown the entrance and the ones that are shown the exit doors. Indian refugee policy added a new form to it. It deliberately excluded a community that constitutes the second highest population of India after the majoritarian Hindus. The Home Minister of India, who was also behind the promulgation of this bill, gave the argument that since the refuge is provided to people fleeing from Muslim majority countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Muslims would not need it, the refuge. So an argument that falls flat today when the Taliban has reoccupied Afghanistan, while the pertinence of the CAA and the logic behind is still hotly debated. Moreover, the arguments that Muslims did not need any refuge did not hold true at that time either, as many Rohingya Muslims refugees were waiting on their boats in the Bay of Bengal, which is the east coast of India. And Ashil's Membe statement, I quote, "The state persecutes, imprisons, and eliminates certain population so that political and social contestation can be neutralized. Those repressive tactics are operated not only by totalitarian regimes, but also by contemporary liberal and illiberal countries," unquote, aptly applies to this situation as the Indian state deliberately decided to let the Muslim minorities be prosecuted in their home countries, as even though these countries are ostensibly majority Muslims. There are different communities who are vulnerable within the same religion, and they get prosecuted because of their customs, roots, and orientations. A notable example was of Ahmadis and Hazara Muslims in Pakistan, and other persecuted minorities like homosexuals, atheists, and political dissidents. The bill had another ramification on the Muslim minority already residing in India with refugee status. This bill would also benefit people already residing in India as refugee by reducing the duration of obtaining nationality or citizenship from 12 to 6 years. So earlier they had to stay for like 12 years, now 6 years is fine, which indeed made it possible for some 30,000 refugees already residing in India to immediately benefit from this bill, but except for the Muslims. So on a very similar note, in 1965, Enoch Powell had pronounced something very similar to our Home Minister in India. He said, I quote, "We should not lose sight of the desirability of achieving a steady flow of voluntary repatriation for the elements which are proving unsuccessful or unassimilable, positioning himself thereby against the migrants that, according to Hanif Qureshi, a Pakistani writer, consisted mainly of the Pakistanis coming to Britain." So Mohsin Ahmed, another British Pakistani writer, came up with this novel, which is actually this was the subject of my study today, and it's titled Exit West. It is a tale of war and desolation. It is the love story of Nadia and Saeed, who live in an unnamed country. So not naming the country makes their struggle a bit universal. Nadia represents a strong woman who wears a full-size burqa in order to avoid the male gaze and rides her scooter to her work. She first met Saeed in an evening class on corporate identity. Saeed, her partner, works and lives in the same city with his parents, and he has nowhere else to go. So Nadia, on the other hand, lives alone, a decision that, when she took it, even surprised her, as she had gone too far, according to her, in her idea of freedom. Both of them have very precarious jobs. And Saeed's father, who is retired from a university as professor, his biggest regret in his life is to have worked as a professor and not to have done a better job, so that he could have sent his child to Europe. And I mean, this remark is very pertinent, as a writer recently said that the biggest achievement in Pakistan is to leave it. So, which more or less applies to many countries in South Asia, like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, or even India. And it's a bitter truth that paradoxically enriches the literature on migration. So the literature emanating from these geographical locations pinpoints at something that Foucault would call heterotopia, or the difficulty of surviving together, or a juxtaposition of several spaces within a real place that would be incompatible with each other. Exit West combines these places to the reality that we confront today. So I'm just talking about the novel, those diegetic places, workplaces, libraries, cafes, schools, war zones, military occupied areas, cemeteries, and poles to which you can hang, political opponents can be hanged. And it thereby becomes a literary response to the migrant crisis looming all over in South Asia, and especially also in the Western world. The novel further highlights the uneasiness of Western world towards the immigrants who bring with them a violent past and deaths. That's why I think it's called Exit West. It's almost like an imperative. Another example of heterotopia could be seen in The Boat People by Sharon Bala, published in 2018, in which Mahindan and his son are Tamil refugees in their own country. So they are Tamil refugees, but they live in Sri Lanka. So it's the north of Sri Lanka, which is known as Jaffna. And they are the victim of their own government, as they accidentally belong to the rebel clan known as Liberation Tigers of Tamil, LTTE. The father and the son flee Sri Lanka in order to reach Canada, where they both are arrested by the Canadian police for belonging to this terrorist group. So through a reading of these two books, I'll investigate the role of state in creating a dichotomous definition of migrants, the one who are wanted and those who remain unwanted ones. And Foucault's heterotopia will also enable me to make these places very, very prominent, especially reserved for people who belong and who do not belong. And even if they belong to a country, their own country, there might be spaces where they do not belong. So, and on the other hand, this work of fiction, just like many other works, Goat Days by Benjamin and controversial novella by Shumona Sinha entitled Assomo les pauvres, they have a common denominator: the loss in the form of human culture, social support system, and language. A loss that probably instigates the older and the elderly migrants to return back to their homeland in order to die among their near and dear ones. So in Exit West, Nadia relentlessly remains uncomfortable with her existence in her homeland, which is not named, which could be anywhere in South Asia. It could be Pakistan, it could be Bangladesh, or even India. Nadia covers her whole body in order to avoid men and harassment in public spaces, something that will allow her to be more at ease in London and in San Francisco as immigrant, in spite of the violence against the immigrants by the natives. So she keeps on calling them natives, some people who live in who are Londoners, and thereby makes it more difficult for her to come back to her country, and makes it easier for her to mix up with other immigrants like people from Nigeria and from other parts of Africa. And I think in a conference that was recently held, it was on Zoom, and if I remember well, the title, it was called Aging and Dying in Diaspora. I think it was either it was the name of the title of the paper or the conference. So one of the speakers said that there are fewer women who wish to return to their countries towards the old age as compared to men. So, and same thing for the second and third generation of migrants. So Nadia is, I think, a part of that statistics. Saeed, her boyfriend, on the other hand, is more at ease with his own people. It slightly reminds of Brick Lane by Monica Lee, where the men, they actually they go more easily with their own men, whereas women, they find it more difficult. They obviously judged. So so within the same migratory space, they have actually two different spaces. One is at ease, completely at ease. The other one is not at ease. So Nadia's space in her home country, as Michael Foucault suggests, is a contradiction of all other spaces around her. She lives in a small rented apartment as a single woman without any family. She has to smuggle her boyfriend in burqa by telling others that it's her sister. Her boyfriend Saeed, on the other hand, shares his apartment space with his own parents. They live in a peaceful quarter until the day their country is slowly invaded by an extremist militia. And and according to a writer who worked on Mohsin Hamid and his work, it could be Lahore. She assumed that it could be Lahore because actually Hamid was born in Lahore. But then I checked the map of Pakistan. It can't be Lahore because Lahore actually borders with India. So I don't imagine an Islamist militia coming from India to occupy Lahore. So I thought then there was this book from Hanif Qureshi titled Dreaming and Scheming, and he makes it very clear that it could be Peshawar, which is actually the north, and it has borders with Afghanistan. And what happens is it actually fell under the control of Afghanistan a long time back, almost 20-30 years back. So Afghanis, and it was with the complicity of local government because they sold drugs, and it brought money to the local government. So finally, what happens that they leave their own country. They somehow manage to leave their own country by since the country is occupied by using all the savings of their life. Similarly, in the boat people, Mahindan is required to sell all the jewelry of his dead wife and steal from the pockets of the people who lay dead in a war-ravaged Sri Lanka in order to pay an agent for his safe passage to Canada. Mahindan's journey is carried on a ship that is not deemed fit for traveling of human beings, which leaves him and his child prone to death. They somehow manage to reach Canada, and but On the other hand, Saeed and Nadia, they do not have to undergo this ordeal, as Mohsin Hamid employs something called magic realism in his novel and lets Saeed and Nadia cross the borders just through the opening of magic doors, or as they are referred to in the novel as open doors. This use of magic realism works on two different levels. On the one hand, it reduces drastically the travel time between the eastern and western part of the planet. And on the other hand, it clearly effaces any memory of that journey or the ordeal during that journey. This strategy allows the reader to solely focus on the love story, because it somehow remains the love story of these two main characters and embrace their situation through their relationship. Which is not clearly the case with the boat people, as Mahindan and his son's nightmares are made of their voyage in the middle of the ocean. The end of this voyage also marks the end of uncertainty and the possibility of a certain death. For Saeed and Nadia, these matters appear to be secondary. Through the use of this open doors for Saeed and Nadia, the metaphorical borders, or as the recent event have shown us, the last American military plane leaving Afghanistan, like that worked as an open door for few lucky people. Hamid also makes another point. He obliterates not only the distance, assuming that Nadia and Saeed traveled from South Asia, but also the checkpoints, borders, border control, visa issues, which is a privilege only available to people living in some privileged countries. Another point is the irony behind the expression open doors, as these doors are not actually open. Nadia finds that they are heavily guarded, and the only open doors are the ones that lead them back to their own countries, which are not guarded. So, or let's say to the war zones. Parallelly, Mahindan in The Boat People finds himself trapped behind the doors in Sri Lanka, because ironically the Sri Lankan government wants him to remain there with other Tamil refugees so that their camps could be bombarded on day-to-day basis, leading to the genocide of the Tamil people. Agamben would call it an excellent place for the state to exert its modern biopolitics, referring to the concentration camps. A similar story unfolds in Exit West, where the migrants are attacked by the natives in London under the full police view, insinuating towards the complicity of the state. This makes Agamben's notion of politics a bit even more nuanced, as the concentration camps or gulags took place under the dictatorial or totalitarian regimes. However, the current migration crisis revolves around the democratic governments, resulting in the role reversal for ex-colonies like India and Pakistan, who have become perpetrators. And of course, the common denominator is also the idea of necropolitics. Its use vis-a-vis a sovereign power to eliminate certain population and keep the other. So in Mahindan's case, for example, necropolitics is ostensibly visible. His own government wields power over the Tamil people living in camps, as opposed to the Sinhalese, which is the other ethnic, and which lives outside the camps in the south of Sri Lanka, and which is pro-government, of course. And in Exit West, it is not directly the government, but the militia who is involved in violence that results in death and people fleeing the country. Even though there is no direct link established for the complicity of the government, it is implied that the state remains a mute spectator, and which is actually a reality nowadays in the bordering states of Pakistan. Antonio Pele, somebody who worked on this idea of necropolitics, calls it the shared use of violence as part of necropolitics, in which the state usually hide behind a veil of innocence or impotence. And back in India, we call it use of fringe elements. The government doesn't prosecute people; they use fringe elements, and it allows the state to perpetuate violence against those who do not fall under the category of good citizens. Pele also defines necropolitics as a closed entrenchment of political, economic, and military devices oriented towards the elimination of human population, and the whole idea of thanatic ethics appear to revolve around it, as the perilous journeys that these migrants take is an outcome of it. So Hamid, he might get away with a little bit with this idea of perilous journeys through his open doors, but his work also conceals a bigger loss, that is of speech, of culture, as I previously mentioned. So what happens is, this novel is although not part of this presentation, but in her work, Sumona Sinha, her protagonist, it's kind of an autobiographical work. She's from West Bengal. The narrator, protagonist in the novel, and she works for the immigrants who have moved away from Bangladesh to France, and so she works as their interpreter with the French police. So as an interpreter, she compensates for the loss of communication that these immigrants face with authorities. Mahindan's destiny is also tied to his interpreter, literally, a phenomenon that halts any communication between him, his lawyer, the judge, and the natives. Nadia and Saeed do not confront this problem because they usually speak English actually in the novel, as they keep moving from camps to camps as well, and from countries to countries through their magical doors. And also they are rarely seen in communication with the natives. So in the first two cases, one come across a complete seizure of dialogue and the inability to express oneself without any help. And in the case of Nadia and Saeed, it is the disconnect with the people who belong to the host country, or because of the uprooting and thereby the destruction of a real shared network leads to a social and symbolical kind of death during the process of migration. So, and similarly, the state also plays a major role in alienating these people, so that so that even if they are alive, they don't remain alive. Because this poster on your, I think it should be on your left hand side, is actually a poster that was that became very popular in 2016, and I saw it. So it was in Béziers. The mayor of Béziers decided to put this poster, and well, if you look at it, so it says that, those who don't understand French, l'État nous les impose, so the state, the central government is imposing these immigrants on us, and ça y est, okay, finally they are coming. Okay, so les migrants dans notre centre-ville. So I mean, if you look at these people, they were more like presented in, at least in one or two more posters, as zombies. So zombies like dead people. So they were like moving like a herd. So this is something, and the poster on the right hand side was actually made by the Citoyen du Monde to confront this poster, in which they are actually facing you, so you can see them, they are alive. And they are like moving. So I think this is where somewhere literature intervenes, or art intervenes. It's not only about showing the invisibility, as we had discussed in the morning, but also confronting this extreme visibility that actually stigmatizes even more. So I think this is one of the issues over here. So the bodies that lie broken, both literally and figuratively, and which was supposed to be the topic of the novel Temporary People, but I think it won't be there, all create a strong image of the migrants who either die or get destroyed in the process. This process sets the rot within, and death becomes both physical and psychological. The migrants are reduced to their robotic existence in the case of Temporary People, and Nadia, Saeed, and Mahindan die in their own ways, and they get deprived of their social existence, of their freedom, both political and social. So Mahindan also dies as father. I mean, he doesn't die, but he died. He had undertaken this perilous journey from Sri Lanka to Canada only for his 8-year-old son, who is the first thing snatched from him and kept in a foster care. Ironically, he had managed to keep himself and his son together in his home country in spite of the dangers. So, and reciprocally, his son's sole desire also is to remain with his father. So so this is something that a psychiatrist called.
Can't see it, unfortunately.
So he calls it cultural bereavement. I think it'll come back. It'll come back. So as you can see, the cultural bereavement is like the experience of the uprooted person. And so there's always this death that is more figurative, that keep on accompanying them. Now, towards the end, what happens, Nadia and Saeed, they actually separate with each other, they get separated, and so of course love dies, and the novel almost comes to a halt. And in a few last pages, we come to know that they have both returned to their homeland after almost half a century. So 50 years later, they come back to their own country, which makes their age either in 70s or in early, or maybe in 80s. This process of returning allows them to take agency over their bodies, rather than depend on any association or on the authorities to bring their dead bodies to their homeland. A similar notion of agency also lied with Said's father, who completely refused to go back to go to Europe, because he wanted to die in his homeland. So the boat people remains, and on the other hand, the boat people, the novel remains incomplete. The suspense that Sharon Bala creates towards the end highlights the ambiguity that is the hallmark of any illegal migrant's face. So, as I try to present, Exit West and the boat people deal with the migratory deaths that do not only lead to the perishing of bodies in foreign shores, they also add another element of people dying by ceasing to live their normal and ordinary lives. And that's how we come to know how important it is to have an ordinary life, a normal life. Similarly, these two novels call into question the rationale behind the draconian law, like the CAA, that insinuate that there can only be a particular type of refugee, and also highlight the religious politics that lies at the core of migratory issues. So religion becomes a tool of subjugation, at least in the case of CAA and Exit West, and which has a historical wink and a stark reminder of the St. Louis ship that was refused asylum at the Miami port in 1939, and in which more than 900 Jews were trying to escape the Nazi Germany. And this refusal by America and Cuba to take that ship led to the murder of 1/3 of the Jews migrants in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, there's a technical problem with the... Thank you for this presentation. As I said earlier, we're going to take questions only at the end of the session. I hope this gets connected. Do you need
Yeah, she needs it.
Also. But there's some...
I think it's fine. Wow.
The connection, apparently.
I think this connection is loose.
Okay, I'm going to present Anja Benedikt. Anja Benedikt completed a PhD at the Political Science and International Studies Department and at the Institute for German Studies at the University of Birmingham. Her thesis investigated national identity constructions in discourses on migrant integration in the German news media. She completed a placement in the Migration and Border Analysis Unit at the British Home Office and worked as a research assistant at the Center for Applied European Studies at Frankfurt University of Applied Sciences. Right. She's taught modules on social divisions, the European Union, and comparative political science in Birmingham and Frankfurt. Currently, she carries out evaluation research of a government program relating to democracy building and extremism at the Institute for Social Work and Social Pedagogy in Frankfurt. Her research interests are racism and extremism, boundary drawing and belonging, border studies and migration. And Anja's title for this presentation is Resistance and Remembrance in Border Art, a response to the violence of EU border regimes and migrant deaths in Tunisia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Oh, better now? Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much. The title has already been named. Thank you very much for having me here today. I will present on the border art and activism in the South Tunisian town of Zaziz. The continuous rebordering of the Mediterranean by means of increased securitization, militarization, and the externalization of the EU border regime has led to a crisis in migrants' plight and death. I will show how the local Tunisian artist and activist Mohsen Lihiteb confronts the harsh reality of local border death and how these are discursively represented in his constellations of art and writing. So first, I would like to give a short background on the migration routes and development in the Mediterranean in order to then highlight the specific geographical and migratory context of the South Tunisian town of Zaziz. I'm not sure if anyone has heard about this in the room at all. I will then talk about the concept of the border as a social construction and how border art can both reconstruct and dismantle the border, particularly in the context of border death. After that, I will introduce the artist, his sea memory museum and his work, and hence the data and methods used for my analysis. And then lastly, I will show the findings of how his border art is a space of resistance and remembrance that makes migrant deaths visible and that contests the dominant security narrative of the EU border. Okay. So just really quickly, I'm sure you're all aware that there's 3 migration routes to Europe, 2 via over the Mediterranean to Africa, and one is also referred to as the Balkan route. The number of irregular migrants has differed or fluctuated over time depending on networks and smuggling routes, crisis in countries of origin, and the strategy of border enforcement enacted by the European Union or supranational border agencies. Irregular migration via the central Mediterranean route, which is what I'm talking about, peaked in 2011 due to the Arab Spring Revolution that started precisely in Tunisia and that influenced other Arab nations such as neighboring Libya. From 2012 to 2017, Libya represented the main transit and departure point for sub-Saharan Africans from Africa to Europe, reaching its highest number of 181,000 detected border crossings in 2016. This slide, however, is from 2019, so it shows that the numbers of migrants going over the central Mediterranean route has decreased in recent years. This is due to an increasingly fortified EU border and growing violence against migrants in Libyan detention centers. Also, the EU discontinued its SAR operations, search and rescue operations, in 2014 and 17, and private operators have since been criminalized or trying to be criminalized. Also, the EU has been funding the so-called Libyan Coast Guard since 2018 that has tried to prevent the departure of migrants and try to intercept their boats. So while in recent years less migrants use the Mediterranean routes, they've become more and more vulnerable. Already before, the central Mediterranean route has largely been described as the most deadly route. Migration route, but now with the political decisions, this vulnerability has even more so increased. Before I come to Tunisia and Zaziz, I just want to show on this slide or on this map really quickly how more or less the migration route within Libya is, or mostly where also the boats take off. So on the top left of Libya, where it says boats, this is pretty much where most of the boats leave in their attempt to reach Lampedusa or Italy. This is important because on the next slide, I don't know if it's visible, on the very bottom here, where it says Tunisia to the right, the town Zaziz. This is so to say 70 kilometers from the Libyan border. It's the second town in Tunisia from the Libyan border and also the first one that has a seaport. Depending on the currents of the sea, so we've seen on the previous slide that the boats leave sort of on the top left of Libya. Depending on the currents, then sometimes they drift up to Tunisia, and this is pretty much where they reach the beach or the sort of coastline before Zaziz. Right, so next one. Oh, it's stuck, 1 second. Here we go. Right, so I've already described a little bit Zaziz. It's a fishing town that has about 75,000 inhabitants. It can also be classified as a migration hub because it is one of the key points for departure of Tunisians and sub-Saharan Africans in Tunisia, but it's also transit of those who have been picked up at sea and then try to leave again to Europe, and it's also arrival because some people who have been picked up at sea or come through the border, the land border, stay in Tunisia. So in that sense, it's also involuntarily an externalized border of the European Union, where the biopolitical impact of the border becomes visible, because obviously not everyone makes it to this beach or Zazis alive. This is why also there's been most largely represented in the media the so-called cemetery of the unknown. I'm not sure if anyone has heard of it. In the media, we've often have only the sort of mass casualties that are being reported, but not single incidents. However, the cemetery has received quite a lot of reporting in the last few years. It's located just maybe 8 kilometers south of Zazis, in the middle of the desert, kind of a little bit where the salt lake stops and where the shore gets sort of narrow. It is as part of a recycling site of the local town hall that has been used or cleaned up to be sort of a cemetery for unknown migrants. And it kind of looks a little bit like this, where 400 people are buried and only 2 have been identified because they were carrying a passport or were known by a relative. So this is what people or local people are confronted with there. It's not that this stops, there's already a new cemetery built, but it's not part of my presentation. But if you have any questions later, go ahead. Right, so consequently, as I said, Zazis can be conceptualized as an external borderland and a sort of migration hub where this violence of borders becomes visible. This is another picture of the cemetery. With regards to some underpinning theoretical ideas, borders have been argued to represent both a hard and a soft fact. On the one hand, border enforcement and border death are hard, undeniable facts. Like EU external borders are above all characterized by increasing securitization and militarization that is also displayed by Frontex. On the other hand, borders are anything from naturally occurring or pre-existing delimitations, but instead are socially constructed imaginations of boundary and belonging, so-called soft facts. Borders are symbolically and discursively created, reproduced, or contested by different social actors. This is, for instance, realized in the continuous narration of the border as a story, thereby providing the border with meaning. So when there's a socially constructed phenomena, it's always subject to interpretation, and hence power and politics play an important role. So there can be a creation of hegemonic discourses, hierarchies, and boundaries that assert inclusion or exclusion. Socially constructed borders represent a dynamic reality that is positioned in time and place and open to change, particularly in situations of crisis, such as those of border death. There's a level of instability and change that can trigger discursive reproduction. Indeed, the representations of border death are positioned based on who is narrating, what is reported, and for what cause. For instance, the number of border deaths can be used to make the scale of migrant deaths visible, but it can also be used to make the deaths invisible in the form of reducing their personal stories to a sheer number. So Pekut has outlined these 2 established frameworks for explaining border deaths. One is the security framework that identifies border deaths as a result of smugglers and insufficient border surveillance. On the other hand, there's the state centers framework that identifies the lack of legal migration routes together with migration control as the cause of border death. As a result, border deaths can be employed in the argument in favor or against of restrictive policy. While the latter framework, so the state centers framework, is factually more convincing, it is the former security narrative that is dominant in public discourse and hence in exerting political influence. On the other hand, the border deaths then create for non-state actors, in particular researchers, writers, and artists, an opportunity or a role that they can have in the representation of border deaths that can sort of counteract and contradict this hegemonic discourse of nation states. So directing the focus on artists, border art can be understood as art on the border, art born from the order, or art against the border. By realizing and framing alternative representations of the borders, artists can contest dominant narratives and can create an active space of resistance. So here I have two images of the artist that I'm talking about, Mosen, where he's on the beach, which is a little bit like maybe 5 minute or less than 5 minute walk from his house and his museum. He's born in 1953 and he's worked in the Tunisian post office until 1993, when at the age of 40 he decided to fully devote his time to activism. He searches the beach every day for items and collects them. And he originally started out his activism as part of environmental concern. However, since 1995, he started to find on the beach objects or bodies of migrant victims that are, in his words, rejected by the sea. So the migration, or I don't want to call it migration crisis, but migration itself has become like a big part of his activism and together with his environmental work, however. So yeah, he has his museum in his own house, or basically on his own private property, and that is in Tunisia because that means the government cannot counteract it. It's sort of like safe from the government because it's in your private property and it's not an official organization that can be targeted. In 2002, he was awarded the Guinness World Record for having collected the most items, specifically 26,820 objects, within 6 years from the Zazi's beach. He, however, does not simply store and preserve collected items from the sea, but he assembles them into different objects and constellations that are subject to continuous change and dynamic interpretations. So you can imagine the sort of museum, like the building itself, as sort of two garages next to each other that are connected, where he displays items, but then in his sort of backyard, which is on the next one, he then assembles and makes constellations. However, it's not only just restricted to his private property. Okay, well, this one is still on his private property, where he, for example, uses items or objects from the sea to collect something. So this, for example, was in 2019, or in October, where at the time there was the fires in the Amazon. And so this is supposed to like show the burning Amazon and the melting North Pole on the top, and sort of the lifeguard and migrant victims at the bottom of it. But he changes this all the time and makes sort of new constellations. He often sometimes also has school children who visit him, and he sort of then creates new constellations together with him and educates them on it. But it's very prominent that sort of the environmental concern goes together with the sort of humanitarian migration concern. And as I wanted to say, he doesn't only do this on his private property, he sometimes also goes out and creates near like streets constellations. However, then the government can sometimes come and destroy it or whatever, but he's done both. 1 second. Apart from assembling objects, he also has written over 130 poems and many testimonies and opinion pieces that are entertained in 8 blogs. He documents and reflects on his encounter with migrant bodies or belongings in his book, Mamadou et la Silence de la Mer. I don't speak that much French, so. So he identifies himself as an ecological and humanitarian activist, but also artist, poet, writer. Last week he told me he's an intellectual. So he identifies as many different in many different ways. So for the purpose of investigating the representation of the border and border death, I draw on all these different sources that he has, mostly the book, the blogs, but also like from visits to the museums and conversations that I had with him. So to sum up what I found in sort of all the writing and the constellations is on one overall issue is that he documents or that he shows the border violence. Which is one of the dominant representation of the border in his sort of display. He shows how the border violently controls human bodies. He achieves this by documenting and testifying to border deaths, thereby making them visible. Both in his blogs and his books. In his book, he gives testimony about the migratory situation in Zaziz and his own encounters with belongings of migrant victims or migrant bodies. For example, I just highlighted here two things from the book. That it's translated to English, that he just describes how he's found bodies, or also that sort of the violence that it entails, that, for example, there's still body parts in items that he finds, and how these are left often quite traumatic experiences. Just to go back to one slide there, in the first visit to the museum, I naively, as I asked him how many bodies he's found and how he found them. And he was quite keen on then showing me this poem that's there on the right side. It's just one part of it, while he kind of explained to me that one person he found not by seeing this person or sort of with the eyes, but he heard it because it was sort of banging against the rocks, and that's how he wrote a poem about it, which he then read out to me in full length. But I guess that's kind of what the traumatic experience sort of entails. Just go further. He also represents the border as an encounter with violence by collecting migrants' belongings and displaying them in his museum. This two images show the second part of sort of the second garage, where it's dedicated to objects he found of migrants. And he kind of tries to put them a little bit playfully to sort of gain the visitor's attention, but he also always says that he tries to also shock a bit the visitors, so to make a bit them feel the violence involved in the process. But at the same time, it creates a dynamic space. Also an image of the shoes, where you can, for example, see that some of them have little how do you call this? Little they're tied up at the top, so that kind of I was explained shows exactly that's shoes from migrants, because they kind of break in the Sahara and they don't have anything, so they have to tie up the flip-flops so they sort of keep stuck and they hold together, if that makes any sense, because none of us would try to stitch up our flip-flops. Right, and so I just put this in contrast for an image of Frontex that I thought shows really nicely how it sort of contrasts the official narrative of a non-violent border, which is from the Frontex Current Risk Analysis Report. Right. Then the second thing, however, apart from demonstrating the border violence, is resistance. So this is, however, twofold, because on the one hand, documenting and testifying border deaths in itself represents the border as a space of violence can in itself be classified as resisting dominant security representations of the border. On the other hand, Lihitheb also performs resistance to the encountered border violence by practicing this resistance and documenting his personal commitment to solidarity and humanitarianism in every encounter with the objects. So, for example, when finding shoes of migrants, he wishes peace to his friends, and he reiterates to stand united in solidarity. So he writes in his blog. He, for example, also sometimes fills up bottles, these really large bottles, with fresh water and sort of pushes them out to the sea, hoping that someone might find them who is in distress. He also, as many people there, recite prayers when they find victims and also try to give them a dignified burial. He refers to the victims as Mamadou, because obviously they're unknown, so he doesn't know the name. but Mamadou is sort of the West African version of Mohammed, and many people in Arab countries are called Mohammed. So I guess it's like one way of humanizing it, but at the same time of trying to get it right, hopefully, in some way. He also represents Zaziz as a place of friendship and solidarity, so it's sort of the town and the community that stands then in stark contrast to the border violence that it is exposed to. I was thinking, on the one hand, I can see that because many people are active there and they're obviously confronted with this situation. But on the other hand, I figured that it is also a way of sort of dealing with the violence that they encounter that is sort of placed on the region. So it's like compensating for the border violence in order to construct its own community as one that's friendly or an opening. So, for example, in one of his poems, he writes that, or he narrates how Mamadou arrived on a peaceful shore of friendship and that he can tell his mother that Zaziz welcomed him. Right. 1 second. Right, and then he obviously also then makes different constellations with the shoes or other items that he finds and tries to resist that violence by kind of making it playful. I did have a conversation with him actually only last week when I was there, and we were kind of like thinking about, on the one hand, when we make things pretty, we don't show the violence, but at the same time we kind of want to counteract it. So it's a little bit of a back and forth and how you want to deal with that. But yeah. Here, for example, what he did, he found this vest, which was supposedly from a young girl that drowned. And what he did is he put it on a wooden stick and drove it through town. And he imagined that it was sort of a wedding procession, and sort of that the life was cut short of a person, and that he reenacted that wedding procession just to honor and sort of celebrate what could have been. And in that sense, he's kind of like resisting that idea. Like, some people obviously in the town also think he's crazy, but he likes to like put on the clothes and walk around with it and sort of like giving it some form of life back. Then the last and third point that I've found in sort of the writing and the constellation was the issue of like pointing responsibility. And it's clear that he gives reenacts the state-centered framework that he poses responsibility on the EU or national governments in the European Union, blames them for the migrant death because there's the absence of, or there's no legal migration routes. However, as he reproduces the state-centered framework, his main narrative also shows that it's about global inequalities. So this is also a big part, that his rationalization of continuing north-south divide or migration is due to remaining global inequalities that come also out of post-colonialism, which is in Zaziz quite big because of the salt lake you saw there. It's one of the biggest in Tunisia. That is actually, the French companies are producing there for a price that was negotiated in 1913 or something, to a really ridiculous price. And it's very good salt. It's even for medical purposes used in France today. So it comes out this idea of still, it's not just about the absence of legal migration routes. It's still this like sort of global inequality that's still there, and that kind of makes it legitimate for Mamadou. For Mamadous to migrate to the north in order, even what we would call economic migrants, to sort of pursue a better life. Just this, in this context, there's this one constellation here that I have. I just have to see, it's formed with life jackets and shoes that were found and collected by migrant victims. The shoes are placed to form a circle representing the globe, yet they're all pointing towards a light at the top, which signifies the global migration towards, in commas, shining north. He points out that the nature of the shoe generally expects movements towards the front, which hereby denotes the one-way direction of migration to the north. So we know that that's not generally in reality the case, that everyone just moves to the north, but we kind of have a lot of south-south migration as well. But I think this is kind of what the reality of Zazi's is, that it is a one-way direction to the north, at least in that area of the world. And then the life jackets are sort of like placed outside of the globe, which can be interpreted that, yeah, they're there, but they didn't really help, like they didn't necessarily keep people from drowning. And as a last comment on that constellation, the sign Basta Haraga, that's frequently used, is also the name of one of his blogs. So basta is like the Italian, it's enough, or it's like enough of something. But haraga is very specific because it's the Arab word for to burn. But in the Maghreb countries, it's used for in the context of burning borders, literally burning borders, but meaning like irregular migration. And in that sense, it's, however, not necessarily against irregular migration, but it's more against the fact that people have to resort to irregular migration to be able to move freely or to do what they want to do. So it's a very like sort of Maghreb term that is, however, here used in a sense of like enough of illegal, not irregular migration. There should be like a different way, a different means. So in conclusion, as a result, the border art by Mohsen Lihithab has been shown to represent an important contribution, or I argue that it's an important contribution for contesting this dominant unofficial EU representation of the border as a humane frontier protecting from outside intruders. Instead, his art and writing convey by means of personal testimonies and collected belongings from drowned migrants the inherent violence of the border and the EU border regime. New forms of representation are argued to be required for migration and hence also borders. He delivers such new representations of the border and border death by providing eyewitness testimonies about occurring incidents on the Tunisian coastline in real time. His access on location, as well as the conservation of and artistic use of the migrant relics from the sea, credit him with authenticity and a unique approach of narrating and remembering migrant victims. It could benefit, however, still giving voice to the migrants and their families, obviously, which is always a bit of an issue because the victims are mostly unknown, so they cannot speak for themselves. So Lihithab, he tries to fill this gap by speaking up on behalf of the victims. While he has welcomed journalists in his museum over the years and has participated in cultural art exhibitions in Italy and Tunisia, his reach is lacking, and his level of dissemination does not compare to that for example, like Alarm Phone or any SAR NGOs that are equipped with funding, volunteering, and social media staff. He's in itself like a one-man operation on a limited budget, however strongly motivated by personal convictions. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Anja. I think we all see already a web of connections between the two first papers, but we are going to listen to Gwen. So Gwen Cressman is Associate Professor in North American Studies at the Département d'études anglophones, Université de Strasbourg. Initially specialized in multicultural education and immigrant language policies in Canada. She has more recently pursued her interests in migration, identities, and the representation of the other, with a focus on documentary and conceptual photography in Canada. She's interested in the ways photographic representation of and at borders, landscapes, and territories articulate questions of identity and memory. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
perhaps I'll give the title of your paper, which is The Migrant Body as Presence and Absence at the Canadian and Mexican Borders.
Thank you. Since 9/11, the border areas between the U.S. and its northerly and southerly neighbors have been consolidated, budgets have increased, and the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, implemented as of 2009, has imposed stricter, if differentiated, controls on Canadian and Mexican nationals entering the US, thus breaking with a tradition of smooth cross-border travel, if only for Canadians. While the Mexican border has historically concentrated the larger share of U.S. governmental expenses in fence building, surveillance, and patrolling efforts to fight drug smuggling and illegal immigration, the Canadian border in particular has been impacted with the post-9/11 response to the ramifications of globalized trade and terrorism. This paper is concerned with two border areas in particular. The first is the Sonoran Desert across the US-Mexican border that you see in darkish green here west of Phoenix and Tucson, which has seen increasing numbers of migrants die from exposure and hypothermia in their attempts to cross the border, as the prevention through deterrence policy drives them to cross in more and more dangerous areas. According to the Missing Migrants Project, 2,243 persons have died crossing this border area between 2014 and 2019. The second one is the unofficial crossing point between, is one of the unofficial crossing points between the US and Canada, and this one is at Roxham Road in Hemingford, Quebec, on the border with the state of New York. So it's right down there south of Montreal. Some 20,000 asylum seekers are known to have irregularly stepped into Canada at this location since 2017. As W.J.T. Mitchell points out, however, even as illegal migration has become more difficult and dangerous, migrant images travel with much greater ease than the people they speak of. Thomas Nail writes that some of the most shared and viewed images of the past few years have been digital images of migrants, refugees, and the conditions of their travels and even their deaths. Photo stories of immigration across U.S. borders published in the press in recent years speak of the journeys of illegal, in quotes, migrants heading north to Mexico or Canada, and tend to depict the migratory process as a physical feat. This is underscored in the short text captioning the photos that relate how bodily integrity is constantly challenged by the threat of being harassed, killed, raped, beat up, or crippled for life, or by the extreme environmental conditions on the southern and northern borders. With the exception of one photograph by photojournalist John Moore, which I'm showing here, showing a skull, however, these photo stories of the Mexican border never picture death. Similarly, on the northern border with Canada, while cases of migrants exposed to extreme cold have resulted in severe frostbite and at least one migrant death, no photojournalistic stories that I'm aware of show dead bodies. If very few photographs show the bodies of dead migrants, whether in the press or in the documentary format, the artworks I want to discuss today resort to the trope of absence or to the trace to evoke either dead persons or processes of social and political invisibilization of the living. Hostile Terrain 94 is a participatory art project sponsored and organized by the Undocumented Migration Project and has been directed by anthropologist Jason DeLeon since 2009. This installation shows approximately 3,200 toe tags hanging from a map of the Sonoran Desert area at the border between Mexico and the US. These toe tags, which are the kind attached to the deceased person's toe in a morgue, represent the migrants who died in the desert between the mid-1990s and 2019. They are geolocated on the map where their remains were found. In the book titled Mark Ruedel, so this is the second set of works I'm looking at, the photographer published 7 color photographs of his Crossing series, which featured debris left behind by migrants or travelers in the Sonoran Desert. It leaves the viewer with much leeway for interpretation as to the fate of those whose belongings are shown in the photographs. The third, entitled Roxham, is the Roxham virtual reality installation by Canadian photographer Michel Huneau. It's not about migrant death as such, but I was interested in including it in this paper because it deals with the problem of the visual strategies at work in representing the migrant body, and is concerned with processes of invisibilization that can be physical or social and political. The discussion of what is made visible in art and what is not is inseparable, as Jacques Rancière's work has demonstrated, from a discussion of politics. In this paper, I seek to examine the aesthetics of the missing body as a form of renegotiation of the power relations at the border. I want to suggest that the missing body at the border destabilizes the binary categories of inside-outside and problematizes the border as complex, both in terms of space and time frames. I then go on to examine how the aesthetics at work permit the emergence of new subjects that resist normative conceptions of identity and binary narratives at the border. Finally, I point at some of the issues that the missing body aesthetics reveal about the representation of the border subject. So, to begin with, apart from the title, Crossing, in the Mark Redall series, which evokes the idea of the border, nothing in the photographs themselves indicates where exactly in the Sonoran Desert they were shot, nor do they ever picture migrants. The disjunction between the title of the series and what appear at first sight as empty landscapes underscores the fact that what is being crossed and who is doing the crossing seem missing. This could possibly point to the migrant's state of disorientation at the border. The viewer herself, faced with these desert landscapes, summons mental images of both the border and the border crosser in order to make sense of the photographs. Even as the choice not to represent the migrant can evoke the actual disappearance and death of the border crosser, it paradoxically has the effect of reintroducing the migrant figure through migrant images seen elsewhere. It thus reminds us that the border is both a mental construct and a process, which contradict binary visions of opposing the outside and the inside, the citizen and the illegal migrant. In Roxham, the border is in fact nothing more than a small ditch, which only takes 1 or 2 steps to cross. Yet, taking that step can be momentous in migrants' lives. In the virtual reality version of the series, Huneau dramatizes the border by materializing it in a red dotted line on a 3D map, thus making it hypervisible where there is in reality no line to see. Also, the colorful silhouettes in the installation make the border crosser's presence at the border unmistakable. Similarly, hostile terrain makes the stark black line of the border equally conspicuous, even as it is covered by layers of toe tags in the areas where the greater number of human bodies or their remains were found. By inscribing these locations on the map, the toe tags beckon the absence of the dead body as well as its presence. The maps appear as a space marked by a predetermined order, offering a static vision of the border where the inside-outside dichotomy is presented as natural and unproblematic, whereas the presence of the bodies at the border question and undermine the naturalized, I quote, the naturalized social functions and discursive practices of the map. This is Brambilla and Puch. So if the border is, to quote Parvarti Nair, what shapes and frames undocumented migrants through various bordering devices, whether fences, drones, or video surveillance, the bodies of the migrants also overshadow the border through their conspicuous presence, absence, as they penetrate and mold our imaginaries. In Roxham, the silhouettes of the border crossers are digitally collaged with cutouts from photographs of textiles and various fabrics taken by the photographer at other borders. Images of blankets, tents, clothes taken in Hungary, Austria, and Germany in 2015. The collage acts as a form of inscription on the migrants' bodies of the history of migration. This palimpsestic form, interweaving present and past migration stories, suggests that the narratives of border crossers are multi-layered and complex, and that the events occurring at Roxham Road need to be understood within a global context of / voluntary displacement, where the border writes itself on the body. Conversely, the thick layering of toe tags on the hostile terrain 994 map invites the viewer to see the border area as marked by the superimposition of bodies, each telling its own story. The photographic traces left by the bottles and other belongings in the Ruedo series, the photographic traces left by the bottles and other belongings, just as the paths left by the walkers' footprints in the Crossing series, also entice the viewer to engage imaginatively with the bodies that have marked the land. The fact that the body continues to write on the land, even in its absence, invites us to examine the narratives told at the border. Visually speaking, the Roxham installation offers a strong contrast between the three-dimensional reconstruction of the border in scales of gray, which I showed you earlier, and the colorful silhouettes of the border crossers. Although the body of the migrant is thus made to stand out, the immediate effect of the digital collage is to erase the migrants' real bodies and features. Some of the collages, in fact, suggest that the migrant has merged with the background. The photographer thus protects the migrants' identities while insisting on the body as the site where the narrative of border crossing is inscribed. By way of contrast, the RCMP officers are shown in full. Maintaining the aesthetics of law enforcement as different from that of the migrants underscores the power dynamics of storytelling at the border. In photography, theory, and historical perspective, case studies from contemporary art, Hilde van Gelder and Helen Veskiest discuss the, I quote, literal gesture of cutting into space, operated by Pistoletto in his cutout photographs. This cutting out of space questions the indexical. So this is a silk screen on polished stainless steel. So you have the impression you're seeing someone's reflection where that person is not, in fact, there. This cutting out of space questions the indexical relationship governing the photograph and the photographed, and begs the question of what is meant by being out of place, where being out of place, I quote, depends on the preexistence of a classification of system of some kind. This is Tim Cresswell. The act of cutting out the silhouettes of the migrants in Roxham thus emphasizes both their presence and the fact that they are out of place at the border, or in other terms, not where the order of the police would want them to be. Just as there is a real Maria somewhere, but not in the room where you expect her to be in Pistoletto's photograph, the cutting out of the silhouettes in Roxham suggests that the condition of the migrant is defined as a kind of hovering between presence and absence, a life on hold. In a life on hold, while the migrant is in a quasi-permanent state of immobility, the definition of identities, whether understood in normative and or existential terms, is necessarily at stake. Crossing number 14 by Ruedo is quite gripping in this regard. The Guatemalan passport appears to stand in for its owner's absent body, but even as it reveals something about his or her nationality, the story behind the passport remains to be deciphered. One wonders who the owner of the passport could be, why the passport was left behind or lost on the trail. Franco-Moroccan photographer Ito Barada, speaking of would-be migrants awaiting passage in Tangiers, tells us that people do not speak of migrating, but use the Arabic term for burning, as you said earlier, Anja, meaning that the migrant has burnt his papers, his past, the law. In this world, the Guatemalan passport left behind speaks to the radical negotiations of identity that the migration process entails. The migrant's indeterminate status between absence and presence, periods of action and periods of waiting, acts as a reminder that the migrant's state of absence, I quote T.J. Demis, is a result of the political disenfranchisement that they are trapped in. I'm sorry, this is not Demis, this is Ito Barada speaking. The child skipping over a puddle of water in the Roxham series very literally embodies this life on hold. It draws attention to those who are, I quote Sam Durant, it draws attention to those who are, quote, even frozen in transition between lives and countries, unable to lay claim to citizenship, not so much subjects in process as subjects on hold, subjects in stasis, whose freedom to move is violently circumscribed. Even though migration is driven by a hope for a better future, it also implies loss, for some leaving friends and family behind, giving up social status and recognition, shedding parts of who we are, while for others the migratory process means the loss of life, but not necessarily the end of the process, as the bodies of the identified in the desert are repatriated to their home countries, while new generations follow suit. In the Hostile Terrain 94 project, the localization and the identification and the naming, when possible, of the remains found in the Sonoran Desert attempts in Jason de Leon's term to, I quote, breathe life into the data. Hostile Terrain 94 is a participatory installation where each host, whether it be an educational institution or an NGO, organizes locally the filling out of the 3,200 toe tags by volunteers willing to spend half an hour or an hour writing out the names of the deceased, as well as the possible causes of death. Also, more volunteers have been videotaped reading out loud the tags of the identified and unidentified bodies, respectively color-coded, with the manila tags for the former and the orange tags for the latter. Reintroducing a form of corporeality, both in the act of writing out the names and of putting faces on names, emphasizes the fact that each body has a narrative attached to it. A narrative made up of, I quote Parvardinaire again, millions of invisible everyday acts, as opposed to the abstraction of border statistics or the spectacularization of the border crossing as event. This corporeal engagement with the installation speaks to the immense loss of life while ensuring that memory lives on. Importantly, it restores the migrants' agency, the capacity to write their lives. In this sense, I understand Hostile Terrain 94 as an attempt to reintroduce meaning in the migratory choices made by those who lost their lives, or as an antidote to the idea of a life on hold. The tension between the body's presence and absence in the works discussed to express the idea of a life lived in a state of suspension problematizes the representation of border crossers through the questioning of their aesthetic and political inaudibility and invisibility. The visual subtraction, which is an expression I borrow from T.J. Demis, the visual subtraction operating here also points to an absence of, again, Demos, referential certainty, which invites me to further question the strategies of representation at work. So Jacques Rancière situates the census at the heart of politics, defined as, I quote, an activity that redraws the frame within which common objects are determined, or, as it applies to the border, in Lee Rodney's terms, I quote, the census shifts, dislocates, relocates, however momentarily, the established relationship between sites, bodies, and things as they are ordered by the border. Thus, binary relationships between presence and absence, inside and outside, legal and illegal migration, collapse in the face of complex realities and shifting identities. New subjects emerge out of the renegotiations at the border. In this regard, the tension between the body as both present and absent in border aesthetics redefines the border as a site where the power differential becomes visible in new ways through, I quote Davidson, the reinscription of the missing body in aesthetics. As its title points out, Hostile Terrain 94 has visited 94 different locations around the world and is now extending the operation to more countries, among them France. The itinerant dimension of the project, its low cost, about $2,000, and the installation kit provided aim at facilitating the distribution of the migrant image by way of contrast with the migrant body, which remains subjected to restrictive borders, laws, and regulations. In this sense, the hostile terrain exhibition can be seen as a critical reenactment of what Jacques Rancière calls the distribution of the sensible, in which the order of the police, which coincides with the natural order of the borderline, I quote, pins bodies to their places. Literally pinning the toe tags on the map renders the accumulation of dead bodies at the border visible, thus revealing the stories that remain untold, unheard, and unseen. Through processes of identification and storytelling that aim at locating the bodies in meaningful ways, the migrants are reinvested with an agency that had been lost. Just as its southern counterpart, the line separating the US and Canada is equipped with highly sophisticated surveillance equipment in the form of cameras, thermal imaging, and ground sensors. The mise en abîme of the photographic act, you see the photographer on the left-hand side of the photograph. The mise en abîme of the photographic act and the Roxham series and the hypervisibility of the red line marking the border serve to draw the viewer's attention to the danger of slipping into an act of surveillance through the commanding view of the border itself and through the act of clicking on the migrant figures. The telescopic vision of the border offered through the superimposition of photographs onto the borderscape, the successive opening of windows and the act of zooming in give the spectator the sense or the illusion that the magnified image will help deepen her knowledge of the border crosser's experience. This is an idea I borrow from Azoulay. By returning a reflection of herself to the spectator, the window reminds her that she is engaged in an act of picture-taking, thus performing and actively participating in the surveillance at the border. The gesture of clicking on the migrant body is therefore a potentially violent one that threatens to consume the migrant figure through the desire to experience what she goes through at the border. The window then, like the border, separates, divides, and creates a distance which underscores the unknowability of the border and draws the spectator's attention to the bordering process at work. Paradoxically, the great strength in Ruedel's series Crossing is that it never pictures either the border or the border crosser as such. The absence of migrants emphasizes their social and political invisibility, while the objects on the ground act as a kind of, I quote, uncanny and unsettling evocation of those who were once crossing. In The Devil's Highway, Luis Alberto Urrea describes the process by which the migrants themselves, like evanescent figures, seek invisibility by brushing the traces left by their footprints on the trails they walk across, so as to avoid being tracked down by the Border Patrol agents. The aesthetics of the missing body therefore recognizes and exposes the limits and contradictions of photographic representation. If, according to Ariella Azoulay, I quote, the gaze of the person photographed is what signals a consciousness of the spectator beyond, the suppression of this gaze through the death, absence, or cutting out of the migrant could constitute the limits of the aesthetic choices made in the works under study, as the border crossers are deprived of their capacity to look back, either at the spectator or at the photographer. Interestingly, however, it is the very inscrutability of the migrant's gaze that draws the spectator into a process of re-examination of what might have been, and in this sense, I borrow from T.J. Demis, frees the migrant from representation. By way of conclusion, whether through the renunciation to capture the migrant's image in Crossing, the choice of collaging the silhouettes in Roxham, or the use of the metonymic toe tag in Hostile Terrain 94, these works all resort to an aesthetics of the missing body, either through absence, erasure, or replacement. I have attempted to show how these visual strategies highlight the ways in which the body overwrites and is written over the border in a dynamic process, enabling the emergence of new subjects whose stories point beyond the border. The aesthetics of the missing body also recognizes and exposes the limits and contradictions of photographic representation, which like borders themselves border as they seek to deborder. Sam Durant and Catherine Lord, in the volume entitled Essays in Migratory Aesthetics, Cultural Practices Between Migration and Art Making, define migratory aesthetics as the various processes of becoming that are triggered by the movement of people. Visual strategies that point to the migrant body as a missing body also point to the ontological difficulties that simply being at the border imply, but I find reintroduce the possibility for migrant agency. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we can take another 10 minutes for questions. So please go ahead. Yep.
Now?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. It was more a question for Anja. I was wondering how the local population in Zarzis were dealing with the closeness, the fact that the island of Djerba, which is a touristic island, is very close, and how they were dealing with the visibility of these remains. And also if you heard about this documentary by Olivia Deez, made for Arte Television, about migrants' bodies in Tunisia beaches. It's quite recent, and yes, it is. If it's something you've been confronted with during your fieldwork. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Is that okay? Not so much. No, okay. Not the documentary that you've mentioned, so I would be actually interested in if you can name it later to me again. There's one documentary that's called Strange Fish by Julia Bertulus. I would have to look that up. How do you pronounce her name? She's from Italy, and she made one in 2016 about the Tunisian fishermen, which is quite interesting. And then there's one that should be coming out, or it's been delayed because of Corona, and it's from a Spanish director. It's called El Camino, that has been filmed there in Zarzis. So I know it's finished, but I don't think it's premiered yet. But there's a trailer as well as like a little one. And I know that some people who from Zarzis are involved with them, so they kind of work together, obviously, with both of these directors, or in the past have. So I think it's quite... there's not like one way of how the community reacts. I think it's very, very different. So, I mean, it's, as you mentioned, Djerba is so close and so touristic, but at the same time, Zarzis it tries, but it's very disconnected, if you like, I feel. Because most people are there rather still poor. It is still the fishing town. They try to increase also tourism. There's now also some hotels there, or the fishermen think about how we can make like an activity to sort of like take tourists out on a boat. But I think it's more ideas rather than reality yet. So I think it's rather disconnected from the tourist place. I mean, when I drive there and I walk around there, they don't look necessarily strange at me, but it's not like being in Djerba where, you know, it's more common for tourists to be there. And but then at the same time, many people in the area want to leave for Europe themselves. So generally the whole south of Tunisia is rather the area where most people like to leave. So for example, the person who is mostly involved with the Tunisian Red Crescent, or the sort of Red Cross, and who has done a lot of work at the Migrant Cemetery, his wife and 2 grandchildren went on a boat without his knowledge 1.5 months ago. And for him, it was quite shocking, because obviously he buries people who die from the route, and then his like own wife goes on to do that. But the fact was like that the grandkids didn't get a visa to be with their mum in France, so that they were denied several times, and that was like ultimately the last thing they did. And so they have 2 sons already in Paris, and so they're now basically reunited with their family. And I guess his wife, who does have a visa to go back and forth, I don't know if she stays there or not. He said he will stay in Zazi's because he's like a fisherman. It's kind of like he's born there, it's his thing. But yeah, most especially of the young people like sort of want to leave themselves, whereas rather older people who are more engaged in the activism, they sort of warn them of the process. But then, yeah, some people like really don't care about it. But then at the same time, many community organizations have emerged at the, you know, so it's very diverse picture. Yeah, it's not one way, but that's kind of like my experience with it. So when they sometimes have these events that they sort of like try to, you know, make like a show cultural diversity where people like cook different like African foods and have some things, and while others are totally not involved in this at all. I think it's like similar to where here or Europe as well, I would guess. I don't know. I hope this answers your question.
Yes, it's very interesting how people who lost their own relatives are later getting involved into these actions. And in this documentary, this guy, the head of the Red Crescent, is interviewed, and he explained that these cemeteries that you shown at the beginning, they are actually somehow a backup for removing the bodies from Djerba Islands, from the resorts. So for me, the connection was stronger, but maybe that's just my view from
yeah, do you mean Mongi Slim? That's the one.
I think that's him is interviewed.
Yeah, that's probably that is the head in Medellin of the Red Crescent. Yeah, I mean, when we say the bodies are found in Zazi's, it's not necessarily that they are like at the port. It's like at the whole, obviously at the whole strip it is. But I think it's mostly that and deported to Zazi's because that's where the cemetery is. And I think the problem generally in Tunisia is that if you don't know the religion of the person, then you cannot bury them in the designated cemetery. So there is like a Christian cemetery at the border or some in another town that's nearby, and there's a big one in Sfax, which is like 3-4 hours north. But the problem is generally like it could also be Muslim victims, but if you don't know, you don't know where, you know, so and that's like the issue there. And then it really is up to the local community to make space. So obviously the local community Zetas had no money whatsoever at all. So they kind of like put a little bit of the recycling waste side to give it. And the new cemetery that's now completed this year, but started 2 years ago, it's on private property bought by an Algerian artist who had the money. And he could only buy the property because he has 2 daughters who are married to Tunisians, so they have the nationality and are allowed to buy property in Tunisia. And so, yeah, it's really tricky. So it's literally the new cemetery for the migrants is on private property that is maintained or like sort of constructed by an Algerian artist, but then contracted out to the Tunisian Red Crescent. So. Yeah, anyway.
Yeah, it was thank you very much for your talk, and it was a very short question related directly to the other one. I was wondering whether there was a religious ceremony and whether it was, or all the Mamadous are deemed or considered Muslims, or whether is there any religious aspect to this burial, or is it just neutral burial, dignified as you said, but in what sense, and according to which culture, or to how are the dead placed?
I actually often get this question.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Yeah, it's not a ritual burial in itself, because I mean, in some ways, if you read the media stories, or if like Shamsuddin, the one who's like the main prominent figure for the cemetery, if he explains the story, they always say about, yeah, we wash the bodies, which is according then to Muslim burial. And I think if they could, they really would. But the fact is they're not actually doing that, because most of the bodies they found are so decomposed, it's not possible to do so. But they like to tell the journalists that that's what they do, because I think they just want to portray that that's what they would like to do, really. And I think it kind of actually makes them feel bad that they cannot do it, in a way. And so the journalists always write that, but this is not actually what's happening. But I guess they would do that. And then they, so the artist I talked about today, and also the main person dealing with the cemetery or portrayed in the media, they continuously tell me that they like to recite different sort of prayers. So they both would, I think, identify as sort of more humanitarian rather than Muslim religious. So within their community, they're not actually considered very religious. But it's more of a more humanitarian, I think, motivation. So they say like, yeah, they just look up something from the Bible or something, and then they would like sort of make a prayer when after like a burial. And to them, it doesn't really matter. For them, it's more like they just like try to cover more things. So hopefully they get something was right for it. So, but I guess it relates to more like trying to make something dignified for the person. Rather than sort of imposing their own sort of religious ideas, yeah.
I have a question, if I may. I'm sorry. A question which could be answered by any or all of you, actually. Echoing this morning's discussion about the problematic parallel which was drawn between slavery and migration. I was struck by all those images of shoes left by migrants, which obviously remind us of the shoes left by the Jews after the Holocaust. So I was wondering if that question had been tackled by either the artists or... Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I think just after that I had a discussion with the speaker. Well, actually, well, as you said, I mean, as it was being said, it remains analogy, like, you know. So, and there was this book that I discussed in my presentation, although I didn't discuss it in deep, and it was actually suggested to me by Judith, Goat Days by Benjamin. And in this book, for instance, goat days. Okay, so Benjamin, like, you know, it's with a Y actually. So what happens? It's an Indian writer from South India, from a state called Kerala, and they send people in a herd to the Gulf. Okay, so what happens once you land in the Gulf? They take away your passport, and your owner literally has control over your body. Okay, and in the novel, I mean, the only way to get away from that place was to attempt to commit suicide. Okay, so that's one thing. So in these circumstances, and they are actually literally made to work like slaves, because that's not what they are promised. Okay, so it's slightly between indentured and slave. Okay, so because in India, for example, when they are sent to these places, they are promised, like, you know, better jobs. But when they land over there, their employer just like snatch them from the authorities, and they cannot even go to the police because the employer has their right on their body. So it takes the passport. And I think, you know, like in the last conference, like which held on Zoom, I was saying something about the football stadium built in Qatar for the World Cup. Something similar is happening, like, you know, there are so many Nepalese migrants who died, like, according to Guardian, I think since the day they obtained the contract till today, I think there are 600 dead people. So you see, like, you know, on the one hand, it's, I mean, we cannot equate these things, but, you know, like, you know, you end up losing your life. So how it can't be, like, you know, made in, like, you know, considered in similar terms.
You had a question. Oh yeah, actually I had a question for Anja. It related to the term constellation. I was just wondering whether you use that term or whether that's a term the artist uses. Yeah.
No, that's actually something I used for like sort of constructing different with the objects. I don't think he uses a term at all. Like, and he just like sort of displays pictures or the things itself. I would have to ask him how he calls it, especially because then it would be like a French-English translation as well. No, I use that, yeah, in order to sort of just show how different objects are mounted on each other to present something, yeah. But I'm not the art. Yeah, I don't know how you call this an art sort of